Oh, hi there. I'm Jason Gorber from thatshelf.com, and we are here talking about what happens in the midst of COVID is that Disney decides to actually ramp up their release of the film version of the mega musical Hamilton. This is Lin-Manuel Miranda's look at Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, Burr, and all the Lafayette, and all the people around the founding fathers and the story behind them. And what he's done, if you've sort of been under a rock, as it were, is taken a fascinating biography of this fascinating individual and taken it to a completely different level and seen it through a very different lens, namely the lens of the African American, the Caribbean, and the Latin American community, and how these founding mythologies, as it were, of the American experience can be told through song in a heightened level, taking the musical influences not only of Broadway, there's tons of Broadway references here, but also of hip hop, primarily 1980s and 1990s hip hop that Lin-Manuel Miranda obviously has a great deal of affection for. When the musical came out, it became an absolute phenomenon, completely shattering records on the stage. Miranda had a great deal of experience and success before, especially within the Heights, which is actually going to be coming theatrically quite soon, pending all the nonsense that we're actually dealing with right now. In the Heights is a very sort of relatively simple book, as it were. The story of the actual musical is relatively straightforward. It's a story of a community, a grandmother and a grandson working in the store and stuff like that. But musically, it's quite intricate. It employs lots of his some of his father's Puerto Rican rhythms in the music. It's quite fascinating, and it was a very, again, for what it was, a groundbreaking musical of its own. Then came Hamilton. Hamilton musically is doing something, again, that a lot of people have completely responded to, of taking the elements of hip hop, glomming it onto the musical experience and doing it in a way that truly hasn't been, for lack of a better word, integrated in quite as elegant a way before. The dynamic is such that you have things that are echoing everybody from Notorious B.I.G. to, I mean, there's Run DMC elements, there's Grandmaster Flash elements, but there's also tons of overt Broadway references. I mean, there's a lick right out of Jason Robert Brown's Last 5 Years that actually closes off one of the musical numbers. So here you have somebody absolutely well-versed in not only contemporary pop, but also contemporary musical, and managed to do it in this epic, wide-ranging show, something truly extraordinary. When I first heard the musical, I was frankly a little bit underwhelmed. I'd heard the sort of hits, the opening track, which is very rhythmic and simple, with all its 5 chords going through, building up. It's very repetitive musically, which is part of obviously drawing from hip hop, which often takes a loop or a segment, a sample, and simply does the story on top of it. So I was somewhat underwhelmed until I actually listened to the whole show as an entirety. It really doesn't work, I think, in terms of segments. There's a few songs that stand out after repeated listening, but it's not like a traditional musical where you know that they're the show-stopping numbers immediately on first listen, nor is it in some ways like a traditional rock musical that plays strictly as a standalone series of songs that has some things that sort of connect it. It really plays as a whole play. You kind of have to sit down and listen to it as a 3-hour experience to truly get what it has. The bombardment of ideas, the dynamic of all the characters, the way that things play off against each other. And as much as you can get from it as an audio experience, to see it live and to see it on stage, it takes it up a whole nother notch, which is why I'm actually very excited that this film actually manages to capture the theatrical experience. Now, I get super tired of when you have films that are translations of plays taken from the stage and make into something that's for the big screen, and they do it and it feels like you're sitting in a theater. It feels like they didn't go far enough with the film. In many funny ways, this film completely belies any of my arguments about that, because this truly gives you a sense of what it's like to be sitting in the theater. Closest I can think of it actually is the Springsteen film that was done for Netflix, where you truly felt that you were getting what the experience was like of actually sitting there in the theater. Yes, it's a film live performance, but it's done with an elegance and a sophistication of story, of editing, and all those elements to not make it as overt as it is, that there's the artificiality that there's clearly cameras there, but sometimes there aren't audience members there, and sometimes there are, and all that balance all coming together in one truly extraordinary testament to what the original cast was able to accomplish. And that's the other thing. I've often wished to have this type of documentation, frankly, of the original theatrical experience. If we do a movie version, if we do that sort of thing, I'm more than happy with that when filmmakers actually take it and make it their own and expand upon it and employ the general devices of cinema to make it something bigger than what we had sort of on the stage. But in this case, we truly have what we want, which is this is what it was like and what it is like to see Hamilton on stage. And this is what it was like with this extraordinary cast that was put together for the original production. You really get a sense of the interplay. And by the time they actually filmed this, they were so comfortable doing this that it hadn't reached the stage that they were sort of tired of doing it, but nonetheless, they were there to actually have it without any sort of blips or any sort of hiccups along the way. Lin-Manuel Miranda is obviously the heart of this production. He's also probably the least accomplished of any of the performers. And I mean that with absolute due respect. He's incredibly charismatic in this lead role, but just he's surrounded by people who are so incredible. Somebody like Daveed Diggs just shows up, and his charisma, his intensity just immediately sort of elevates everything that's going on. Just truly, truly remarkable performers. So you have Lin-Manuel writing for these other characters, especially Aaron Burr, people like Lafayette, people like Washington, giving them their moments to shine. This is not just a one-person band. As Hamilton is obviously the central character, it's really about those people surrounding him, which gets into sort of my sort of way into this. I have a great deal. I grew up when the 80s mega musicals were a thing. Obviously, the likes of Phantom, but Les Mis in particular was incredibly formative to me, as it was for Lin-Manuel. And there's lots of Les Mis elements here. You can definitely see in Washington echoes of the Valjean character. And even the way that the stage has the spinning turntable is very evocative of the way that Les Miserables was staged. And above all, the dynamic truly sort of echoes something like My Beloved Jesus Christ Superstar. Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical took the story, the myth of Jesus, the story of Jesus, the biblical Jesus, and twisted it and asked some hard questions. What would it be like if he came instead of 4 BC? What would it be like coming during a time of mass communication? What would a Hamilton be like if he showed up in a 2020 when we're questioning everything about our society, when we're discussing the roles of immigrants on shaping what it is our nation, about the dynamic of the sort of landed class, about how our economic structures come into play. All of these dynamics absolutely at play. But more importantly, of course, Hamilton begins with the admission of Burr saying that he's the damn fool that shot him. What it's like to be the one who's remembered as the murderer of the great icon. Sort of usurping any of good intentions, any of the elements. Burr was equally a fascinating character. In some ways, more fascinating. His rise was frustrated in many ways by some of the elements that Alexander Hamilton actually got to take over. And the dynamic as it plays out is absolutely in keeping with that intimate connection that you have between these two characters, just as intimate as the characterization is between Judas and Jesus. It's a very fascinating narrative choice, and it really brings us into this story that we can see the rise of this, frankly, obnoxious individual who's incredibly polyglot, who writes like a fiend, writes like he doesn't have time to get all the words down, and in his relatively short period of time on this earth, shaped his country, and frankly, in many ways, Alexander Hamilton shaped the entire world. His methods of banking, of the writings of the Federalist Papers, and the shape that they've had on world democracies are absolutely phenomenal. So that as that plays out, you actually have a story that's completely engaging and completely draws us in. Once again, musically, there's for me a number of highlights. I love the King George song. It is the most straightforward and most frankly, musically-ish moment, but it's where the production actually gets a little bit of lift from everything going on, a little bit of sarcasm. And to see the performance here captured the way it is with all of its spittle is completely phenomenal. But you have Theodosia, you have all these, the incredible dynamic between the wife and sister of the wife of Hamilton and how they all play out. These beautiful moments where all these, again, these quote unquote secondary characters are allowed to shine. And you see that their contributions not only to the myth of the founding of the United States, but also to the background and the history of this remarkable individual. As a production, as a film, it is a phenomenal insight into what it was like to sit in the theater. Now, I happen to have seen the last production, the last day of production in Toronto, the day before everything closed because of COVID, and it was a very surreal experience. I knew I wanted to get in and actually see it live before everything shut down. But to be there and to have this sense that people were genuinely there and enjoying and enthusiastic, but even the cast didn't know what the future would bring. And so there was this weird sense of we're on the cusp of something that we didn't understand, that we knew was coming. And most people, frankly, were not thinking about it at all. I think they were just there enjoying ourselves. And there was a moment I remember sitting on, I will never forget, that I was over the stairway looking at masses of people coming in. We had been sort of sanitizing our hands and trying to, as much social distance as you could in a crowded theater, aka not very much at all. But just this sense of that people did not realize how radically their lives would be changing in a short period of time. It was the next morning, some 12 hours after we left the theater, that the Mirvish company shut down the Toronto production temporarily, and obviously things are not opening anytime soon. Hamilton will inevitably be tied to COVID in a funny way for me, because that's how I saw the show. And now this film production coming out sort of earlier than the intended. Obviously, they want to do a big theatrical experience, but this allows people, frankly, throughout the world to experience this this show at home, to get a sense of what it's like, to get a sense of almost a world that we've sort of put aside for a short period of time, hopefully a short period of time, of this sort of live theatrical experience where people are coming together, where there's massive people, not only in the audience, but also on stage. And so there is that sort of surreal element to this. I am concerned, I mean, aesthetically concerned. It's not such a, everyone has life to do. I think people are going to watch this not as a 3-hour sit-down, treat it as a theatrical experience. They're going to sort of flip back and forth. Watch 10 minutes here, watch 10 minutes here. That's kind of the way that I first experienced the music. And I really don't think that people will get why it's such a thing. There's something to be said about being there and taking it all in as one piece, which really, really benefits this production in particular. It's the dynamic of characters playing off one another that truly elevates the narrative, and that it's the musical echoes that occur throughout that you might not pick up on if you're sort of giving, a couple days back and forth. Look, our lives are such that not everybody has the 3-ish hours to actually sit down and sort of consume it all as one thing. But I highly recommend, if you actually have a chance, to turn out the lights, take the intermission if you want, and actually take it in one fell swoop, as it were. So as a reminder of what this show is, as a sort of immortal documentation of what this production is and what it meant to musical theater at a particular time, at a particular place, the film does an extraordinary job. There's some technical elements that will be a little bit off-putting for some. There's certainly some sync issues. They are not singing to a click, which is actually a really good thing. So clearly they've done a recording, a very clean recording of the show itself, definitely live, allowing the musicians and singers to actually mess with tempo, mess with articulation. But there are times then where you're cutting back and forth where the mouths aren't quite in sync. And again, it's one of those frustrating things that you never know if it's your equipment or if it's the production itself. I had to go and double check my settings to make sure that there's nothing going weird with the streaming that I was watching, particularly in this new world where everything's sort of being brought down over the internet. You're never quite sure if it's your fault or if it's the fault of the actual source. Sometimes on Shiny Disc, if the problem is actually on the Blu-ray, the DVD, or the 4K, it's probably baked into the production.
Nonetheless, there are those like little quirky moments that might bring you out somewhat, but mostly the shots, the actual way that it actually takes place is pretty straightforward. There's a front on, there's a couple off the sides or the wings, and then there's some from sort of front row balcony, and then some from top down, so you can actually see a little bit of the movement. Again, that's sort of Les Mis round table type notion that's taking place there. So really, you have a sense that you have the best seats in the house. You have an angle, you have the front row center, which is where I had the pleasure and privilege to actually sit. Front row balcony, which is obviously a fantastic place to sit. And it really makes you feel like you're part of the audience. In fact, the most sort of jarring ones are where clearly they put a Steadicam or some sort of rig on stage and they're swooping around the characters. That's actually the least interesting, I think, parts visually, because the play is never really meant to be seen that way. The super close-ups, particularly when you have King George singing, the spit coming almost in 3D into the camera is a little bit off-putting. I mean, yes, he's quite famed for his spittleness, but nonetheless, the way that it's shot certainly gives much of the emotion, which is what it's meant to do, the sort of wry movements of the eyes. But again, because it's a theatrical experience, we don't always see it. The performances are a little bit bigger, inevitably, because they're playing to the back of the rafters. And because of that, it's actually those close-up elements that I think are the least effective at conveying the theatrical experience. In some ways, I would have preferred that they kept it a little bit more distance, maybe with a couple zooms, and avoiding those sort of on-stage antics where you then cut back and know there's no camera there. It's very much saying, hey, look at us, this is what we're doing, and that brings us out a little bit of the proceedings. Other than that, I could not be happier. The sound is extraordinary. The band is ridiculous. In some ways, I think that the New York production was allowed to mess with it a little bit more than the touring production, and in a really good way. The conductor allowed, because he actually did the original, he allowed greater fluctuations in the sort of franchises, as it were, the touring productions, which have to be inevitably so you know what you're getting and it's closer to the recording. This, after years of them actually doing the show, has allowed little moments that if you really know it, you're like, oh, that's fun. The drummer's having fun here. Or you can actually hear a little bit of the piano doing something slightly more adventurous that was on the original. So that's Hamilton. It's on Disney Plus. You get to see it all over the world. You get a sense of doing it. I implore you to crank the volume as much as you can. Find the biggest TV you can get or a projector to see it as close to a theatrical experience as you can. And if there's one thing that I can heartily hope for, that you actually take the time for this, that you sit down and watch the beginning to the end. And I really think you'll have an extraordinary time with this extraordinary musical. For ThatShelf.com, I'm Jason Gorber. Thanks so much for watching. Everybody, please stay safe, be well, and we'll see you next time. All the best.